let's get started because prep time is over. Let's just see if all the judges are here. Aniket, are you here?
Yep, I'm here.
Ian?
Yes.
Rotem?
Yeah.
Good stuff. Cool. Opening government, are you here?
Yes, Calix speaking first, please.
Guys, I'm just checking if everybody's here. Sorry.
Oh,
Opening
sorry.
opposition.
Oh, is here, yeah.
Thank you. CG?
CG is here.
CO?
Yes, CO's here.
All right. So while we do the introductions, can I just get everybody to sort of like in text, type in the chat and let me know if you consent to live streaming or not, just so that we have that in the chat space and Equity can track that. Cool. So I'll just get the judges to introduce themselves first. Hello, everybody. I'm Floopy. I'll be chairing this round. My pronouns are they or them, but just refer to us collectively as the panel. That'd be wonderful. Cool. Can we get Aniket to introduce themselves?
Hi, everyone. My name is Aniket. My preferred pronouns are he or they.
Thank you. Let's get Ian.
Hi, I'm Ian. Preferred pronouns he, him.
Thank you. Rotem?
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Wotan.
Okay, cool. Opening government. Can you just let us know what your preferred pronouns are and also your speaking positions?
Yes, Calix speaking first, please.
Hi, Joseph, DPM, no preference.
All right, thank you. Opening opposition.
Hi, everyone. Speaking first for O is Ivan. I prefer he or they, please. Thank you.
Speaking second is Chris. Here they. I will flag that I'm not feeling too well, by the way, so I may head off after my speech. So if I disconnect, that's why.
Cool. Closing gov.
Yeah, speaking first, no gender pronouns preference.
And I'm speaking second.
All right, thank you. Closing opposition.
Speaking first, Jonathan, he, they.
And speaking second, Caitlin, she, her.
All right, thank you so much, everybody. So yeah, just a couple of quick reminders. I'll be timing the round and I'll be putting 167 time intervals in the chat space, but definitely just time yourselves because I am not perfect. Secondly, please respect people's POI preferences. Indicate those preferences before your speeches start, just so that everybody knows that right before you start speaking. Yeah, without any further ado, let's call this. Actually, let me just do a check to see if everything is good on the consent front. So PM and DPM consents, LO and DLO consent, member and Gov Whip consents. Closing opposition. Do we have closing opposition's consent here?
We consent.
Both of you consent, yeah? Okay.
Yes, yeah, we do, yeah.
Cool. We have a very consensual house. All right. Let's get the Prime Minister to start. Here.
1 second, just quickly setting up.
I'm sorry, before you start, sorry, Ocom, do we have to wait for you to like start the live stream? Oh, okay, cool. All right, yeah, we can start. Let's go.
All right. 3, 2, 1, go. Esteemed panel, in opening government, we realized that the narrative that love is sacrifice has caused huge amounts of harm in the society in terms of A, specifically victimizing women, especially in our society, and B, also just making the patriarchy more sticky to get rid of. Ultimately, we just need to prove that this narrative does more harm than good. We don't need to prove much in terms of how prevalent it is / how much it dominates each individual mind. At the point at which this narrative, we look at whom this narrative helps and how many people it victimizes it. That is the point how we win this debate. But first, a few things. What do we need to know for this debate? First of all, I will talk a little bit about what this narrative looks like. Then I will look a little bit into who hears it. Spoiler alert, mostly women. And third of all, ultimately, what kind of behavior that ultimately results in, especially in contrast to how otherwise we often see relationships that are healthy, and with what kind of attitude such healthy relationships usually persist. Okay, first things first. We on a daily basis are bombarded by the trope in media of this romantic image of one partner sacrificing everything and demanding nothing in return for the wonderful beauty of love, right? This is something that we get in children's media and songs. Songs for the Draw were a great basis. Leonard Cohen basically has a PhD in framing love as sacrifice. Amazing stuff. Ultimately, it is something that is culturally relatively pervasive, and it's largely also targeted to women. Why is that true? That is largely true because women are conditioned in our societies and our patriarchal system to strongly believe that their role and purpose is to be found in family and keeping their family happy, while dudes are largely conditioned to understand that they are supposed to be the breadwinner, are the decider, to make decisions, and ultimately the woman makes sacrifices in general. And this narrative specifically allows people a permission structure in order to stay in a cycle in which reciprocity is not much of a thing, and to ultimately give up more and more within such a relationship. We think that this targets women particularly strongly, especially if they aren't like super left-wing feminists, but have a more conservative outlook, and it's something that is mirrored around them community-wise. They've been raised with this. We think that therefore they are particularly strongly targeted recipients, especially because men are generally expected to be the one to enforce the sacrifices, because they ultimately are the breadwinners. Ultimately, for instance, they are expected to go to university, and the woman, rather than study at a different university in a different country, to stay at home and forfeit her education to some extent. Ultimately, what this narrative does, when you believe this and you frame it to yourself mentally as something that is inherent to the relationship, something that is fine, that sacrifices are something that are meaningful in such relationship without asking something in return, you're going to do that more, and we think that is pretty atrocious. Now, what does this ultimately kind of behavior? What does this sort of justify? Like we see this narrative in action whenever for instance, like you have excuse structures. Oh yes, he's a bit stressed. He couldn't do me. He didn't talk to me, or he hit me or anything. But ultimately, love is sacrifice. If I make it through this, I have given this relationship the power it needs to succeed. I can be right. I can make it right. Ultimately, this is something that mentally is a trap that we reinforce strongly because this narrative exists and permeates our society. We think that this is pretty awful. Now, why do we think, first of all, that love is sacrifice simply is not true? We believe that, first of all, because like in a good relationship, ultimately it comes all down to compromise to some extent, right? You want the other person to be happy, they want you to be happy, and ultimately you figure out the best way that you can do that together. What does this look like? This looks like me and Joseph both having partners that live in very different places. My girlfriend is in London, his is in Australia, and ultimately it's incredibly taxing and tough to keep that going. But the difference is that because we have not internalized the narrative, this doesn't feel like a sacrifice. This feels like a reciprocal arrangement that where both our partners and us communicate what we need and try to get the best out of it. This is not something that we mentally perceive as a sacrifice. At the point at which we did perceive that as a sacrifice, it would be something we would give up the idea of reciprocity. There would be no expectation as strongly to kind of to come closer to each other, because ultimately you forsake, you forgive, you don't try to arrange yourself as much at the point at which you have internalized the idea that that sacrificing something for this relationship is meaningful. This is particularly bad when the other partner in this relationship, for reasons that I've already given you, probably will have internalized that narrative less, right? At the point at which like in a heterosexual relationship, the man is conditioned in a way to opt in less to that narrative, and women are structurally more likely to opt into it on a larger scale. That is the point where you have structurally and the male expecting more and more sacrifices to be given, whilst the woman largely sacrifices her happiness to some extent. But before I move on, does closing have an extension for us? Opening?
If the other person is not willing to sacrifice for you, presumably this is a sign to you that they don't love you, and therefore reciprocity falls on our side of the debate.
Like if that is the kind of perception and the lack of communication in your relationship, that's probably going to be a relationship that's doomed to fail and likely to already result in pretty bad patterns in terms of how you behave with each other, ultimately not being greatly conducive to long-term happiness. One thing we need to realize also just about such relationships, if like the first enthusiastic love is of course a biochemical reaction that is likely to make us overestimate that impact. We will then often within this space where we are chemically deluded. That is where we make a lot of decisions of how we are going to shape the dynamics of our relationship. And at the point at which sacrifice seems something romantic and beautiful to you, that is the point where you already start up more likely to establish a pattern where you take a step back for your other partner, who gets used to this, and ultimately you get trapped in a cycle where you are more likely to keep giving up things and undermine your own happiness and chances, which ultimately leave you in a horrible place once that relationship fails, because you have not been able to openly communicate with each other, or are less likely to, because of this understanding of I am the romantic self-sacrificer, especially if that ultimately may lead to resentment. What we think this makes also significantly more likely at the point at which you are trapped in such patterns and community around you spots it, you're also way more likely to really be trapped in pretty toxic relationships, right? This idea of love is about sacrifice is a great way that misogynistic pricks basically get you to opt into more, giving up more and more of your own good and framing it as something that you're doing for the family. We think this is bad, and especially because this narrative is around you in the community, this is like, people are also way less likely to spot red flags at the point at which they talk to you and you talk about all the things that you're doing, etc. Because as long as love is sacrifice, and this is a choice that you make on the basis of romance, this is something that will lead people less quickly to point out in what kind of dire situation you found yourself in. We think that this is atrocious. OG.
All right, thank you so much. Let's get the leader of opposition. Here.
Okay, can everybody hear me fine?
Yeah, you're good.
Amazing. POIs in the chat, please. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Judges, our world today is culturally very individualistic. There's a huge pressure to focus on yourself and your own growth and your own success. It's good, therefore, to have a countervailing narrative which says that loving other people, sacrificing for them and supporting them is not only acceptable, but even good and should be rewarded and encouraged socially. We are going to explain inside opposition how this leads to stronger relationships and helps the most vulnerable people in society. Before that, a little bit of framing. Notice that the sacrifices expected from you socially are proportional to how much you have and are able to sacrifice. Why? Because people's expectations of you socially are proportional to your surroundings and their own lived experiences as well. That will be important later. Two things in this speech. Firstly, why you get stronger family relationships and why that's so important. And secondly, on better romantic relationships and the value of that as well. Before that, quite a lot of rebuttal to OG. I think they had two main claims. The first is on the idea that women are disproportionately forced to sacrifice, and this is unfair in them. Three responses to this. Firstly, notice that on both sides, if you're in a relationship, you will need to make some sacrifices. So, for example, the chores just need to be done on both sides. And I think on both sides, unfortunately, because the patriarchy does exist on both sides, it's likely to be the woman who has internalized the social expectation that this is the person who needs to do that, right? So on both sides, unfortunately, women are pressured into doing this. The difference is that at least on our side, you can feel good about doing this. And yes, this is kind of messed up. Yes, the patriarchy is messed up, but at least on our side, the vulnerable people feel good about themselves and get some kind of social redress, even though on both sides they suffer some financial harms. But secondly, this narrative is reciprocal, and that's very important. For example, a guy needs to give you quite a lot of money, for example, if he's socially meant to be the breadwinner. So in these cases, you both benefit somewhat from this relationship. Notice then that on our side, if the other party in your relationship doesn't sacrifice, your partner doesn't sacrifice, you can spot that, and you know that this is not a loving relationship at that point, because uniquely on our side, sacrifice is tied to love, and therefore you have a social justification for being able to leave your relationship and spot these kinds of exploitative relationships early, uniquely on our side, at the point where there's a social justification for saying, he's not sacrificing enough for me, I want to leave, right? This means on our side, people leave bad relationships earlier, and that's a good thing. But the third response to their idea is on the trend. This is not a retrospective debate. This is a debate about impacts going into the future, right? I think increasingly there are more guys, especially in more developed countries, who are taking up chores, who are taking up like more egalitarian roles in relationships. And you want to do this because you want to virtue signal, you want to feel like a good person, like not a sexist person. I think this is an increasing trend. Therefore, in the future, I think the value of this harm greatly diminishes on side proposition. The last thing to respond to this is on this idea how, yeah, you just are tricked into continually sacrificing. I think this is really not true, but if you feel good doing it, then sure, I think that's fine. But I think eventually, if it's going to be so much, you're just going to stop doing this and leave their exploitative relationship. And that's a minority of cases anyway. Okay, suspensive case. Firstly, why get stronger family relationships? I think this falls into two levels. Firstly, on the elderly, I think that on our side, they're more likely to be cared for by their children in their old age. Why does it happen more on our side? Because these children, they grow up, they get a job, and their parents grow elderly and retire, and these children look and care after them. Why does this happen more on our side? Because you have a narrative to tell you that this is a good thing, that because you have a duty and you love each other, you should be looking after your elderly parents, and you feel good about doing this. Why is this narrative so important to make this happen? Because on both sides, you might feel some sense of duty, but there are so many other things that you can spend your money and time on if you're like a grown adult, right? Like your own career, like your own spouse, your own children. I think that's why tying sacrifice to the love you have within your family is so important, to get you to sacrifice more of your income and support your parents, and that's why more of that happens on our side. Why is this a really important impact? The idea that more children sacrifice for their parents and look after them in old age. 3 key points of weight. Firstly, it just applies to everybody who gets to old age, so it affects a very large number of people. Secondly, it applies to a very vulnerable group of people who are not able to work for themselves. Uniquely on our side, there is somebody who supports them. Thirdly, these people often have very few alternatives that can support them, right? They don't really have that many friends. Many of them may be already dead. They're not able to work and provide for themselves. And in a vast majority of states, pension funds are chronically underdeveloped and underfunded. So for the conclusion then is that uniquely on our side, this very vulnerable, very large group of people get more support through their relationships, because we say that this is a good thing and should be a part of these relationships. Secondly, on children, I think this is also very simple. I think that on our side, parents are more likely to devote more resources to paying for their education, or even making other sacrifices, like leaving your home, leaving your friends behind to move to a different country, move to a different city in order to get your children a better education. I think it's a really big and important sacrifice, and it's more likely to happen on our side when you have the narrative that says that this should be a thing that you're doing. This means that children get more opportunities, and therefore we get a better society on our side, and you're better able to take care of your siblings and other children as well if they're not doing so well, because you have a duty towards them. And this duty uniquely on our side entails some sacrifice, entails that you have to give up some income, entails that you have to sacrifice time with your friends to help these vulnerable people. I think it's something which is more likely on our side compared to other countervailing considerations that exist inside proposition, given the framing we gave you about how we live in a very individualistic culture otherwise. Before we go on, PY from CG.
Yes, chores being done is a compromise, not a sacrifice. Sacrifice means giving up on something extremely important to you, not divvying up household chores.
Yeah, exactly. Sure. I think that's not really what this debate is about. That's like a rebuttal to an OG case about like how this is done in a sexist way. Okay. So point 2 then on better romantic relationships. Okay. Why do we get better romantic relationships? A few reasons. Firstly, I think it's about growing your personalities to be more compatible, right? Something which is very, this looks like working on yourself, working on your personality to be less impatient and be more kind and caring, for example. I think this doesn't happen. So this happens more likely on our side, because it's something which takes a lot of efforts, something which takes a lot of courage, a lot of personal, emotional, and physical sacrifice, right? And I think it's kind of a collective action problem, because it's not something you really want to do, but if both you and your partner work on yourself and work on your personalities, you end up with a better relationship overall and in the long run, right? I think that's why you need the narrative to overcome this collective action problem and say this is a good thing and you should do it, and the long term this leads to healthier relationships. I think this is better on our side, right? So relationships are more compatible on our side. Secondly, they last longer. I think some sacrifices are necessary for you to be able to last longer in your relationships. For example, one person moving house somewhere else or giving up their job in order to be able to start a family, or for example, just other kind of emotional sacrifices that you can make, right? I think that this also means that when you make the sacrifices, you trust your partner more, and therefore you have a bigger bonds and relationships that last for longer on our side. What are the impacts of this and why this is so important? 2 hugely important impact of stronger relationships. Firstly, when you're at your most vulnerable, for example, you've lost your job or you're feeling a bit depressed or something like this, for example, you need that safety net, you need that support structure, you need your family. On our side, people are more likely to look out for you, even at the cost of their own family, even at the cost of their own income, because there's told socially, this is a duty that you have to sacrifice for the people you care about, right? So that when you're at the most vulnerable, you have that safety net on our side, people let you stay at your house, people support you financially and sacrifice in that way. But secondly, it gives you meaning, gives you personal validation to have a really important person in your life who tells you that you're really important and that they love you very much. I think this is something which is very good for you and happens better on our side when you get more meaningful relationships. Look, we explained to you how you get better romantic relationships, how we help the most vulnerable people by counteracting existing narratives which tell you to be individualistic and say, no, it's okay, and it's actually a good thing for you to care about other people and sacrifice for them. For that reason, side with OO.
All right, thank you so much. Let's get the DPM here.
I'm just making sure that I'm audible.
You are.
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, Calix is right. I haven't seen my girlfriend since Thailand Worlds. There is a world in which some people might consider this a sacrifice. I do not. This is the woman that I'm going to marry. This is the woman I love with all of my heart. And every second, even though it is at a distance I spent with her, makes me happy. There isn't an instant where I feel that I'm giving up something or where I feel unfulfilled by my relationship with her. And this is what we think the ideal is like. What opposition is defending is a scenario where you're feeling that you have to give something up to have that kind of feeling of being willing to live with someone, even if there is a cost. If it doesn't feel like a sacrifice to you, then it isn't a sacrifice for you. If it feels like a sacrifice for you, then you require this narrative to supersede that emotion you're feeling. Without that narrative, if you feel that you're actually sacrificing something, maybe you shouldn't be in that relationship. Maybe your parents, having treated you shittily, don't deserve you taking care of them in your old age. Maybe parents have duties to their children irrespective of whether or not this is a sacrifice, because the children don't have a choice in whether they are born or not. It is unclear to me why this narrative is what creates any of the actions that opposition talks about. It is unclear to me why, for me to feel and adjust to my partner and feel happy with them and enjoy their presence, why I require that as an engagement and why I require this specific narrative to actually engage with them. Notice, however, that the only response we get in terms of this entrenching toxic relationships is, but you expect the other person to sacrifice for you as well. Let me deal with this rebuttal at length, because once I take this out, the responses from opposition are insufficient to take over Calix's speech. What we say on our side of the house is that the fact that both sides are told the narrative symmetrically does not mean that both sides internalize the narrative symmetrically, because what Calix has explained to you is that women are already culturally and already disproportionately, regardless of context, both in like everywhere in the world basically, are generally told to accept more shit than men. This is just objectively true. This is also then and notice that the only response we get, but men also do more chores. This isn't really the guys we're talking about. We're talking about the toxic dudes on our side of the debate that, actually actively gaslight women into thinking, I'm giving up so much for you and you're not doing enough for me. I just want to get laid tonight. Can't you just give this to me? Love is sacrifice. It is this kind of egging on of other individuals that it forces them to give up things they don't want to in a narrative that disproportionately impacts women at a rate significantly higher than men. Notice then that on this comparative, why are women more likely to internalize this narrative than men? Well, because they're generally speaking told that, they are the ones whose duty it is to take care of their family, to take care of their children. They're the glue of the family. The family is centered around them, right? There's this kind of perception of the mother that brings it all under one hood. Even like the girl boss types, right? That she can do it all. She can get the job and she has the kids and she can get it all under their head. These kinds of narratives are prevalent in all kinds of societies, regardless of geographic context, specifically because of structural misogyny that exists in every place in the world. Notice then that at that point, this kind of narrative isn't one that dudes are going to internalize in the kind of way that opposition is talking about. And more importantly, women aren't going to expect it symmetrically of men, because they are more likely to be predisposed to actually accepting the fact that they're supposed to be the ones sacrificing. At that point, it doesn't mean that they expect sacrifice symmetrically. Notice, however, that even if they expect sacrifice symmetrically, this is entirely symmetric on both sides of the debate, because whether this narrative exists or not, on our side of the house, without this narrative, people just expect their partner to make them happy. If you just expect your partner to make you happy and your partner doesn't make you happy, then you also leave them, meaning that even at the best rate of opposition's response, that you have a symmetrical expectation, which I reject, but even if, then at best there's just no delta on side opposition to side proposition. At that point, I'm unclear why any of that matters. Notice then finally this whole idea, even though I already touched on it on rebuttal, that this makes it more likely for us to take care of our parents. I think that if you love your parents, you will take care of them. If you feel that your parents don't really deserve it and it's a sacrifice, then you're probably not that happy about helping them in the first place. Because notice that people who have really great parents who took care of them all their lives, who really invested and really went above and beyond, those aren't the kids that leave their parents to starve in retirement homes. It is usually the ones who just barely feel it is their duty, the ones that are forced and coerced by societal expectations to take care of their parents. And I'll be really frank, if you're a shitty parent, you probably don't deserve your child to take care of you in that manner. I don't understand from opening opposition why somehow old people have an inherent right to the fruits of the labor of the young just because they put them into the world against their will without having asked them, without having had their consent. Because newsflash, you can't consent a priori before your creation, meaning inherently that duty doesn't exist on children towards parents. At that point, then, I think parents need to earn that kind of treatment from their children. And presumably, if it's not a sacrifice, if they treat their children and the children feel that this is just what they want to do because they love their parents so much, then this is going to happen anyways. Opposition then has to explain to me why shitty parents deserve this and why this is more important than the toxic, abusive nature and the terrible parents this actually protects under their side of the house, as opposed to, nice, good parents. We think that's then the question. Before I continue, it's like close to 6. Does closing have an extension from me of sorts? 5, 4, yeah.
You can't just redefine sacrifice to mean something that is unspeakably bad. It's still a financial sacrifice to put your parents in an old people's home, even if you love them. I don't think
I'm not redefining it. I'm not redefining it. I'm not talking about whether it is or isn't a sacrifice. I'm talking about whether you perceive it to be a sacrifice. Because when you do something out of love, when you take an action that you want to take, usually that's then just something you want to do because it makes you feel good, because you feel, oh, I'm taking such good care of my parents. They were lovely people to me. Now I'm getting to pay back, right? You're living for each other's sake. It's still, of course, in reality, it is a sacrifice. In reality, technically speaking, it is a sacrifice that I don't see my girlfriend for 2 years and that the only exchange we have is via the phone. But the fact of the matter is it doesn't feel as such. And the narrative doesn't change whether or not the reality of whether something is a sacrifice or not. It changes whether or not when I feel that it is a sacrifice, I internalize and accept this as being an acceptable status quo. This is the comparative in this debate because the reality on the ground doesn't shift, right? The realities of whether my parents were good people or bad people are symmetrically true on either side of the debate. The question is, how does it impact my behavior and whether or not I ought to act in that way based on what this narrative tells me. We think on net, this narrative is one that more likely entrenches toxic behavior, more likely protects toxic people, and more likely actually damages people who are most worthy of protection. I don't understand why opening opposition wants to protect bad parents so much. At best, at best, this then makes it more likely that parents on our side of the house have a higher incentive to treat their children well. Proud to stand on proposition side.
All right, thank you so much. Let's get the DLO to close the case for opening up and the opening up. Here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, one moment. I'll take up your line chat. Put it there. I'll call on you. Don't mute, please. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Look, the world is a nasty place. And the first thing I would do in this speech is when I want to explain why the majority of the harms you want to talk about are probably symmetric in this debate. First of all, as far as women are concerned in terms of abusive relationships, what I want to flag is that this is quite independent of the love you're expected to have for your family, but rather it is predicated on the gendered role that society puts on you, especially in more conservative communities. I.e., what this looks like is that if a woman marries someone and becomes someone's wife, even if she doesn't love him, there is still a societal expectation that they ought to take care of the family because they have a duty to do so independent of any feelings that they have toward this person. And it's simply the case that you're expected to stay at home and you're expected to take care of the family in those communities where people are more conservative. And I think it's therefore the case that this expectation is going to exist regardless. Why? And I think it's the case that the people who are in power and who are able to perpetuate these narratives or things, like popular media or movies, have an incentive to do so regardless of the point at which you have already been raised to believe these things to be a priori good. But secondly, they have the ability to benefit from these systems. And therefore, I think it's the case that you're likely to be pushing for this narrative in order to oppress women regardless on either side of the house. I really don't think this motion is going to be a tipping point in those cases. Secondly, I think the narrative that pushes people, especially in Western societies, to what's best for themselves and to be as individuals individualistic as possible also isn't going to go away. What this looks like, and note that this especially applies to men, is that you ought to be prioritizing your own career, your own development, your ability to make money and prioritize yourself and live the good life under capitalism. What I want to point out is that like what exclusively usually happens is that this stands in the way and prevents women from being able to fully exploit or like to fully express their potential to live the good life in the first place, exactly because they have those superseding expectations based on them. Like I think that regardless of what like the narrative of love says, women will be expected to be like more soft and more selfless, especially by people who like, you know, buy into these gender roles to begin with. And therefore, I just really don't think this is symmetric. The next thing opening government says is that it's the case that you have to compromise to love and that this is separate from sacrifice because it doesn't make you feel bad. I think that it's like, you know, fitting to have a quick reality check here. I don't think sacrifice necessarily need to make you feel bad. Like by definition, what a sacrifice is that I'm giving up a benefit that I would have otherwise accrued. For example, this may be, you know, being able to move somewhere to have a better job in order to maintain the relationship, because I'm expressing to the person that I'm in a relationship with that I value the relationship more highly than any other utile benefits which may have accrued to me as a result of not making the sacrifice in the first place. I think that the important thing to note here is that, first of all, this is likely to be proportional. Why? I want to note that the most powerful mechanism in order for people to ensure they're fulfilling the duties is self-checking. I.e., the reason you're likely to do this is because you're likely to feel bad to the extent that you aren't doing this thing in the first place. But second, you're likely to be pressured by your surroundings, by your friends, by your family, if you're not giving enough to the relationship in what you're in. What I think this means that people are likely to want to give proportionally to their ability to do so. For example, if one of us were to go ahead and donate like, you know, £1,000 to a charity, it's the case that people are going to think that we have done a good deed. But if someone like Jeff Bezos donates £1,000, for example, he probably hasn't done that much compared to his ability to do good. And I think it's the case that people will push themselves to do as much as they can, especially because they want to see themselves as good people. I think this is especially important when it comes to the abusive relationships open government wants to talk about. Why? I want to note the distinction between a sacrifice and something we're giving willingly. On our side, when the other person in the relationship, especially when we're talking about, for example, someone who is expected to be very selfish, i.e. a man who's expected to prioritize his career, on our side, he's expected to give back to his family, to give back to the woman he loves and to the woman which he has married, which would otherwise be doing all the work in the family regardless, while on your side, it is the case that this person has no incentive to give back. And to the extent that they do give back, as Ordi says, especially in abusive relationships, it's the case that this is something they will be able to hang up over the head of their wife, for example, as leverage. They will say that this is something I gave you that I never had to give you in the first place. You ought to be grateful to me for providing to the family when I never had an obligation to do so in the first place. And therefore, when we're talking about harmful relationships, it's much easier to make the people who are being abused feel like they're the ones who owe something back to the person abusing them. On our side, rather than it being another benefit, you expect the other person to change themselves and to give up things to make you feel better, to accommodate for your needs and for your desires. And I think this uniquely makes it better for people who don't have anything else to stand on, the people who are expected to sacrifice on either side of the house. And therefore, I think we're able to decisively win this clash over opening government. The next thing they say is that it's a case if you're able to, you're probably going to sacrifice much early in the relationship because it seems romantic and it seems beautiful. I think that the simple response here is that young people are probably going to do silly shit regardless. But first of all, when you're very young and getting in a short-term relationship, one, you're not likely to want to give up much because you first want to see if it's sustainable. Secondly, what this means is you're likely to give things up at an incremental pace. You want the other person to give things back to you, and you want to see the long-term sustainability of this relationship before you commit. And therefore, I think this is like a very easy task you can perform early on. You can ask the other person to sacrifice for you the same way you're sacrificing for them. And if you see that they don't want to give back, you know that this relationship is not likely to work. What happens on their side is that people get stuck in relationships where they basically gaslight into thinking that the other person actually loves them. The other person keeps promising things to them that they never give back, and they always feel like they're the ones in the wrong, the ones that they're not appreciating the other person sufficiently. And I think that therefore, when it comes to abusive relationships, this gets that much worse. Next thing that opening government says, is it's the case that you shouldn't be giving back to your parents because you have no choices whether you're being born in the first place. First of all, I think obligations exist regardless if your existence is arbitrary. Even though it's like random that I was born in Greece or in France, for example, I think that the Greek state still has an obligation to protect me. Secondly, if someone were drowning in a lake, we still have an obligation to save them to the extent we're able to do so, even if you had nothing to do with them ending up in there in the first place. If you see someone in a horrible condition, you have an obligation to protect them. Before I move on, I'll take opening quickly, sure.
When something feels like sacrifice for you, then it's not good for you. If you perceive whatever action you're taking as a sacrifice, it's toxic to accept this as an acceptable norm for you. If it doesn't feel like a sacrifice, you don't need this narrative.
Okay, I don't think sacrifice feels bad. I don't think it's tantamount to masochism, right? What I'm the flag is that sacrifice when you're giving up a different benefit for someone else. I.e., you see that the benefit isn't accruing to yourself, but to the other person in the relationship, but you still value it exactly because you value the person and the relationship you have with them above other things in your life. And this is something which you're expected to express on our side rather than being a benefit. About old people, right? I just want to note that just like becoming old really sucks. People also don't consent to that in the first place either. You aren't able to materialize your autonomy in the first place. You aren't able to do things you like anymore. You're in pain every day, and generally people just end up in a very dilapidated condition. And very often your children and your family are the people who are the most proximate to you in the first place. And the same way that you have an obligation to save the drowning person, even if you didn't throw them in the water in the first place, when you're the only person who can save them, we still think that the children have an obligation to the people who are the most hurt under this motion. Why are impacts the most important? I think the most important thing to do here is, first of all, about not having to worry about whether your relationship is going to fall apart. Exactly because you're able to see that the other person is sacrificing for you. This is a form of reassurance instead of you having to be paranoid every day. Secondly, though, I think it's the case that you get a much more tailored support network, exactly because the other person is expected to change who they are in their personality, to adapt to you, and you know they will be there for you tomorrow. And exactly when your life is at its worst, you know that support network is going to exist for you. And for all these reasons, we're very proud to pose. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Diallo. That ends the opening half. Let's get the member of GOV here.
Am I audible?
You are.
Okay. Second. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 2 points in my speech. A, how it's who exactly is affected, why it affects people in the defined decade in a person that they are making an irreversible damage to themselves. And second, how it makes relationships worse on GOV side of the up side of the house. Just like huge engagement, first of all, it's very important, even though we already flagged that in a pro, I want to repeat that. There is, even though I'm ESL, I know English good enough to know that there is a distinction between compromise and sacrifice. Compromise being, I wash the dishes. I don't like to wash the dishes, but my girlfriend asked me and she doesn't want to do it and she's tired. Look, sacrifices is about moving to another state. It's about being a housewife because the man wants to be like a big shot or something like that. It's about forfeiting your dreams and the things you really, really wish to do. The second thing is about elderly parents. They say that, maybe you love them, but you have work, so you won't treat them. Please note that if you don't love your parent, this whole motion is not relevant. And if you love your parent, yes, you still have a job, but you probably want to meet them. Also, we think that elderly parents they still have TV. Some of them even have Facebook and stuff like that, or they still have friends on the neighborhood. Yes, they might be dying, but you know what? There are always new elderly people that you can communicate with. So we just don't think that the delta they are actually proving is that wide in order for them to actually win the debate. Let's talk about the defined decade, right? We think that this narrative is basically affecting mostly people in their 20 or the start of the 30 years of their life. Why? A, this is the stage when you're actually getting married and you are in love and you are dating and you are fertile to bring children to the world and things like that. And second, we think that the more you get older, for example, 40, 50, 60, you just become cynical because you've seen other people getting fucked over. You know that you have more life experience and you don't learn about life from movies and songs and the way that young people are affected by that. Why is that important, right? Because let's look what kind of sacrifices people are actually asked to do in this defining decade, right? For example, you have a newborn child, so now basically the husband will ask the wife to be a housewife. Or for example, if you don't have a child, and one side wants a child, he will pressure the other side to bring the child to the world. Or for example, let's say that I want to do a PhD in NYU, so we'll ask my girlfriend to go to NYU, even though she still she has all her family in Israel, let's say, and she has a career here. Why we think that it's a huge damage? Because basically this is something that's irreversible, right? Because for example, if you decided to bring another child that you didn't want, you cannot abort it after it was born. But even if you ask to spend years outside of your career or outside of your country where you have like connection and things like that, it's much more complicated to restore that afterwards. Yes, I will get the rebuttal from opposition, say, even if you like retired from work for some years, then you can come back. But to think that this is the crucial years when you actually can do like degrees or can actually make connection, like going back to the job after your kids are grown up. I think it's after you last so many years that you could have experience and you could have like job connections, you won't be able to reach as high as you can. Maybe you dream to be like a CEO or a very important doctor in the university or things like that, and you won't reach that. You reach like lower things, and we think that this is very crucial for things because it's going to affect your whole life. Basically, like we're talking like about life expectancy of 80 years old, we think that this is something that some things are irreversible. Why is that? What are the impacts? A, like for the rest of your life, you need to like bear the consequences of the things that you forfeited, the things that you things. B, you have probably you have regrets because those things probably, if you consider them to be sacrificed, those things were probably so important for you. And third, probably you like after you retired from that life, you probably have some friends that proceeded. For example, let's say that you have a bachelor degree and you thought about PhD. You didn't go there, but you know other people. You're jealous of them. You see them on Facebook putting things. You just think all the time, what could have happened otherwise? And then like the obvious response for this from our bench might be maybe it's worth the sacrifice if love is so important. Please note that this is not a debate whether love is important, but whether our opposition actually is showing a significant delta, right? Because if on both sides we have love, but on our side, like you're just making less sacrifices, we will still have a great relationships. Also, like, let's say that I moved to New York without my girlfriend that stayed in Israel. I will probably be sad for like a year, let's say, but in the worst scenario, but I will be able to find a new relationship, because relationship, unlike job prospects, unlike bringing children to the world, you can actually find like a new person, like we have like 7 billion persons, you probably will find new connection. Or we think that also like we see like 50% of couples actually divorcing, so we think that it's a very short term, and even if you manage to do long term, I just don't know why you cannot do it with somebody else. So this is a very reversible decision. Before I move on, yes, opening, go ahead.
So it seems that your case applies mainly to very career-minded people who don't want to sacrifice. Then you're less likely to spend time dating and less likely to fall in love. So this motion doesn't apply that much to these people.
I think that career people also want to get love. I mean, this is not, this is very extreme, like saying that these two things are mutually exclusive. But beyond that, also, I think that bringing children to the world or being in a different country, like away from your family or your friends or all the things that you like to do in your origin country or language and things like that, those are not related specifically to career necessarily. Let's talk about better relationships, because if you believe the things that we said before about regret, about jealousy, you need to you feel that, and you need to assign a blame for something. We feel that the more likely scenario that you will assign this blame to your partner, because the alternative is that assign blame for yourself, saying, "Oh, I was dumb," and most people want to believe that they did a good decision, and if something bad happens, they're looking for excuses. So I think that on our side of the house, when you get children that you didn't want to get born, or you get partners sacrifices that you didn't want to sacrifice and you regret that, we feel that you assign blame to other people. When you assign blame, even if you don't tell them, you just be disgruntled and sad all the time when your relationship. I think that it's also bad. Very happy to propose.
All right, thank you so much. Let's get the op member here.
There is this illusion up and down the Gov bench that if you are in a loving relationship, that relationship will require no sacrifices because it's loving and happy. I don't think this is true. I think the vast majority of relationships have patches, maybe months or weeks, where you are sad, and require significant compromises for several structural reasons that we're going to talk about in closing opposition. I think as a result of that, any narrative that tells you that this is wrong, that you should not be expecting sacrifice in a relationship, that you should instead, as OG put it in their deputy DPM speech, be expecting that every single sacrifice will be made comfortably, even one as big as going long distance for several years. I think that is a world in which a substantial number of people are sadder and more dissatisfied with their relationships. I think those are two pretty hefty impacts. I want to note before I start that I think there's a significant problem throughout most of this debate of proving why specifically this narrative is a tipping point. I don't think it's likely to be that much of a tipping point. I think people mostly make rational decisions, and particularly when it comes to things like relationships and long-term relationships in particular, which are the most high impact material in this debate, I think people spend far too long thinking about it for kind of subconscious thoughts to really intrude that much. I think, therefore, that this motion applies rather less to decisions which get talked about and get discussed logically, and rather more to people's general dispositions, i.e. things that people don't think about, i.e. whether you're happy or sad, whether you're generally satisfied or generally dissatisfied, rather than making a specific choice, because I think specific choices, you'll be debating the pros and cons and not thinking about that one film where the woman is the housewife. I think as a result of that, I am not convinced by the government analysis, given they have shown no reason why this general cultural backdrop is so important that it sways people's minds from other reasons like economic reasons, or from, I don't know, how much they love each other or what their future plans are, in terms of making the dynamics of the relationship change. Because of that, I think that you should put a lot of doubt over a lot of the government claims. But I further think there's this weird language game going on, particularly in opening government, to a lesser extent in closing government, in which they say in loving relationships, sacrifices don't feel like sacrifices. So the only places in which there are sacrifices are in unloving relationships, which coincidentally fall out of this motion. I don't think that's true. I think there are still massive sacrifices you can make in loving relationships. You still sacrifice a significant amount of money to send your parents to an old people's home. You still have arguments in a family. You still have to make very substantial compromises. And I don't think they can wash this away by saying that in a functional relationship, you won't generally have to make sacrifices because you'll enjoy it. In fact, the fact that you enjoy these sacrifices is itself a product of this general cultural backdrop that these sacrifices are to be expected, rather than something which is just totally natural in a loving relationship. Why do we think that relationships are shit a lot of the time, even when they're loving, and why do we think that's going to get better? Because I think most of this debate has lived in the high-powered, white-collar world of New York City, some place that was repeatedly mentioned, and I don't think it exists in the real world, in which the vast majority of people cannot have it all. I think there are 5 structural reasons why these relationships are going to be unhappy. The first, mentioned in a one-liner by OO, is that there is sexism generally. I don't think this is the most significant of these impacts. First, because it only applies to 50% of people in this debate for obvious reasons, but also because I think economic factors are far more structural and far more important in making sacrifices than general pre-existing sexism. I think the reason why people are unhappy is less to do with sexism and more to do with other structural factors, like the lack of resources that forces choices which in some cases get influenced by sexism. I think the second significant impact is kids. The vast majority of people want kids. Kids are a massive time burden. And if you don't live in New York City and can't afford a nanny, somebody has to take care of kids. There are 3 options. Either one of parents spends time with kids, which is a massive sacrifice, or both parents spend significant amounts of time with kids, which is itself a massive sacrifice because they often have to go part-time and put their career plans on hold, or the kid gets left behind, the kid doesn't have anyone spending time with them. We can all agree that option 3 is by far the worst. In that context, they either have to sacrifice kids' development or accept that there are going to be significant disagreements that require significant sacrifices. In that context, I think it's highly likely you're going to have significant and substantial arguments. Most couples have them, even when a couple is completely loving, in which somebody has to get rid of their dream of being an artist or being being a pottery maker or something, whatever their dream is, in order to spend time with this kids purely because of how big that time burden is. The third reason is that people change. I think the person you fall in love with in your 20s is a very, very different person to the person you're raising a 10-year-old kid with in your 40s because of how people develop under the influence of different cultural things and different situations that they've faced. And I think as a result of that, even in loving relationships, people tend to disagree more as time goes on, and people have to live with each other. If you're disagreeing more and you're listening to a narrative that is saying sacrifice is a small part of relationships and you should really be trying to have it all, then I think that's going to be a recipe for disaster. Fourth, I think the vast majority of people don't have the money to have it all. And I think a structural fact about people is people generally want more than they have because people are quite ambitious and future focused. I think if one person wants to spend money on a car and another person wants to spend money on retraining as an artist, I think there will be sacrifices made that will be uncomfortable. Fifth and finally, there are accidents, there are freak events, there's a family member who's gone to jail, there's a family member who's homeless. All of these things require significant sacrifices from loving significant others. The conclusion of this is I think the vast majority of people at some point in their relationship are going to have to make substantial sacrifices and are not going to have it all and are not going to be happy as a result. I think two things change when you have this narrative. The first is that people get much, much happier because they are inclined to think that the fact that we have to make such big sacrifices is not a reason that we're not in love. Whereas in the world of opening government, it might be a sign that you're no longer in love if you're having fights over sacrifices. Second, I think relationships are far, far, far less brittle. That means you're far less likely to break up or have a strained relationship or move into different rooms or houses as a result of these periodic fights which occur structurally. Because of that, oppose.
All right, thank you. Let's get Gov Whip here.
Okay, am I audible?
You are.
All right. Then I will be starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so this debate suffered from a lot of semantic unclarity, which means that a lot of the team's cases basically rested on what actually is defined like as a dictionary definition of sacrifice and where people like get that message specifically and how that we act on it. I'll try to make this debate a bit more orderly through those two clashes, which the first clash addresses that specific issue. For regardless of the dictionary definition of sacrifice, where exactly is this message more relevant? In what cases, in what choices do people actually need this difference in order to act? And second of all, how relationships look and why we specifically prove that relationships look far better in the general case. Before I get to analyzing these two clashes, I have like two external points of rebuttal. So the first, opening opposition, like about empathy, about a safety net, about not dumping people when they're down. So if like someone being depressed or fired or something like that, it's temporary, then like it's pretty much basic human empathy not to dump them. Like we think that in any basic loving relationship, people are willing to do the minimum amount of not kicking their partner when they're down, regardless of societal message. And if it's something ongoing, if it actively hurts their life, it actively makes the partner unhappy, we're fine with the partner dumping them because we don't think the partner should be obligated to suffer. That's the first. The second thing, about both teams talk about giving back, about small compromises. So it's unlikely people will be unwilling to give anything into their relationship. Like even if we ignore the semantic definition of sacrifice and like look at what general people think, people aren't idiots. They know that they can't have a loving relationship without some give and take. It's unlikely that without this message, people will just be complete morons who think that they can have everything. And also, just because they like the other person, they want the other person to happy, they will be giving just for that. It aligns with their own goals. And therefore, just because it gives them a positive hit of dopamine, they're likely to pour into that relationship, even without that more nebulous idea of sacrifice. Okay, moving on to the clashes. The first, how the message is accepted. So opening government take the extreme side by saying sacrifice is anything that feels like sacrifice. If I am unhappy while doing it, sacrifice. If I'm happy while I do it, it doesn't feel like sacrifice. The thing is that they are dependent on by and large on the semantic definition of sacrifice, and the OO contests that quite a bit. They say that sacrifice is the small things, like every single thing I put into a relationship, like who does the chores, who washes the dishes, like whether I give a bit more to my parents or not, then that is sacrifice. What we say is it's far less important what actually sacrifice is, but it's more, what the thing is important is where people actually change that behavior. What do I mean by that? I mean that in a general relationship, like in a normal relationship, people are likely to divvy up chores because that's what people do. It's necessary to create a relationship, and people know that. Also, it's very likely that parents will give to their children anyways, and parents will want to support their children anyways, not only because they love and care for their children, but because there's a general societal expectation specifically for parents towards their children, and also from children for their parents at a later age. So what we say is that the society, that this message about sacrifice being a part of love, even if it applies to this situation, it's less relevant because it's unlikely that a parent will not support their children without this message. Where does it happen? It happens in the specific cases where people are on the verge. It happens specifically in the cases where I am in a relationship and I need to decide, do I stay with this person and make these extreme changes to my life, or do I move on? Like, it happens specifically in these decisions, in these like momentary decisions that affect a large part of their life. So therefore, regardless of the semantic definition, we say that it only matters when these decisions are large, because when the decisions are small, they're likely to just accept them anyway. And it also happens when they, like in these verge cases where they are unlikely to go on. So given that class analysis, yeah, before I move on to the second class on how relationships actually look, I'll take opening, yeah.
On both sides, the man in the relationship has the power. Opening opposition shows how uniquely on our side, men are pressured to sacrifice for their family. On Prob's side, the guy focuses on himself and does what he likes. That's why OO wins on gender equality.
First of all, we think that the definition of relationships, where all relationships are like completely patriarchal and the man has domination, complete domination of the world, is uncharitable. Most relationships, specifically like in like most relationships are okay. Like most relationships, the partners do love each other and therefore they want to help each other. And also, like, we don't think that the narrative of sacrifice is likely to make an abuser less abusive towards their wife, because they don't think that treating their woman bad is like treating the woman well is sacrifice. They just think that it's their right to be abusive. So we don't see much impact there. Okay, so now specifically how it affects people. So opening government talks specifically about toxic relationships, and like, which is the very extreme case, and also generally a simple analysis about patriarchy and housewife. But our analysis, A, it applies to all relationships, therefore it is far more general. And second, we explain specifically how these decisions are made. Like we say, when a woman says that my partner, like even if it isn't patriarchal, even if it is like about left-minded liberals, like they say my partner is about to move to another university, can my life hold that? Can my life support that? Or they say my partner wants 3 children, am I willing to make this decision for them? What we say is that we are willing to sacrifice basically the ability for more stable relationships and more earlier relationships for better overall life, because my partner gives the explanation on why these decisions are so important, like why a career is so important to establish early in life, because it's difficult to pick up a career later. It's difficult to pick up an education later. It's impossible like to lose responsibility for children later in life. Therefore, these key decisions, these compromises, these sacrifices, which are specifically the places where the societal message is relevant, are exactly the places where we want people to be more selfish. They are exactly the places where we are willing to make people give up a relationship because we know that they will probably find a better relationship later. Closing, do you have engagement I'd like to take? 1, 2. Okay, moving on. Yeah, so to conclude, sorry, I lost my place a bit. Yes. So what we say is that love isn't eternal and love shouldn't persevere, and that this message is just simply not likely to change the difference, because after all, this is a message debate. It doesn't really matter what is sacrifice and what isn't sacrifice. The thing that matters most is when and how people make this decision in an account. And we, by showing that relationships are better when people are willing to pick and choose, when people are willing to give up on current relationships for relationships in the future, when people are willing to more tailor their personal lives to their own needs, rather than just simply accepting the first relationship they have and sacrificing everything just because they believe it is obligated for them. Yeah, I don't have anything more to say. Glad to propose.
All right, thank you so much. And let's get up whip here.
Thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I'd like to thank the government whip for basically agreeing with everything closing opposition have said so far in supporting the idea of sacrifice, supporting that sacrifices are necessary for relationships, and completely agreeing with our definition of what sacrifice is and how this can be applied in the debate. So first of all, let's do some rebuttal, look through the government whip's case in close detail. So there was a suggestion made that this debate suffered from a lack of semantic clarity. The supposed semantic clarity provided by the government whip changed absolutely nothing about the debate, particularly nothing about closing opposition's case. The idea that sacrifice should be based on bigger things and how much impact it has on someone's life rather than smaller sacrifices like who does the dishes, who doesn't. The idea is instead that bigger sacrifices like who raises the children, do you move in together, are the ones to focus on. These are all of these instances are the ones which have been focused on in my partner's speech. Everything closing opposition said was calibrated to focus on large sacrifices and the large impacts they have on our life. We really don't feel that this supposed semantic clarity actually provided anything useful to the debate, so we can just watch that now. Now we're going to look at the government whip's conception of what sacrifice is and the fact that it happens where people change their behaviour. So where and how do people change their behaviour, and do they do it in terms of sacrifice? Again, I find this quite difficult to unpick just because the government whip completely agreed with everything we said on closing opposition. The idea that this the only difference is the suggestion that this matters when decisions are large, thus making them redundant. On closing opposition, whilst we identified the larger sacrifices as the biggest reasons for the biggest reasons to discuss in this debate, we think large sacrifices are often the product of smaller ones and the friction caused by refusing to make small sacrifices and so on. So we think that it's quite disingenuous for the government to refuse to acknowledge the importance of small sacrifices at the expense of larger ones, and then also to imply that this is something that wasn't present in the debate. The idea of the semantic clarity or lack thereof regarding sacrifice was a key missing factor. So again, completely wash that. And looking at how sacrifice and the government whip has suggested that their side of the house is willing to make sacrifices for an overall better life. This is exactly what we believe, what we've already said. So it just shows that closing opposition is again winning. I'm now going to go through everything my partner said and prove to you why this is the most valuable material brought from the debate and why it beats opening half and also the government closing case. So first of all, there's the idea that we were brought by the opening government that a relationship requires no sacrifice or compromise. It's just not a useful one because it's not true. There is no relationship, happy or not, in which no sacrifices are made and people are never miscontented. So before I go on to that, I'll take the POI from opening government.
Panel, don't let CO strawman our case. We do not disagree that sacrifice exists or compromise exists, but when you need a narrative to supersede your own interests to such an degree, then relationships become toxic. If you don't need them, then you don't need this narrative in the first place either. People make net calculus decisions on whether they remain in a relationship.
We don't agree at all with the opening government or indeed the government's characterization that sacrifice is always a bad thing and these sacrifices are easily made if you're in a happy relationship. We don't think that's true, and as my partner's already pointed out, but I'm going to go through this again, so this will answer your point more fully. But basically, we don't agree with you because we do think that sacrifices are always having to be made and that no relationship, regardless of how happy, is free of sacrifice. And sacrifice is not something that is only a feature of a toxic relationship. There are huge differences in how sacrifice happens, and we don't see it as something inherently bad. So there are a huge amount of structural reasons why sacrifice and compromise is necessitated in a relationship, and the ability to sacrifice and compromise is one of the key tenets of a happy relationship. My partner's pointed out that focusing on sacrifice and focusing on being able to make sacrifices willingly, ably, and being able to discuss these sacrifices with your partner. We're not expecting one partner to be a doormat and one not to, or one person in a familial relationship to do so and the other not to. We have instead discussing how sacrifices are completely mutual, and this is a really important tenet of how relationships become happy and how people are happier under our side of the house. So a world where there's no sacrifices is a sadder one. It's one with worse relationships. It's a one in which people are less able to communicate with each other because people need to make sacrifices in order to have any kind of interpersonal relationship at all. So most people make rational decisions based on relationships, long-term relationships, whether that's with a partner, with your parents, siblings, and the most important thing for people focusing on when they make these rational decisions about their long-term relationships is, are they happier? Are they not happier? Is the other person in the relationship happier? Are they less happy? It's completely dependent on both of them. And the government is not convincing in suggesting that the cultural landscape is the reason for these things to happen, particularly opening government in that case. We don't feel that it was analysed well enough and the claims have become confused. However, we have looked clearly at the cultural landscape in our debate and in our arguments and proven why that these rational decisions and the way they're made are really important for both partners. The sort of the argument that one partner is just going to become a doormat or one participant in the relationship will become a doormat was not a helpful one from government and not a very valuable conception of sacrifice. So we feel that sacrifices always feel like sacrifices. That's something that the government have really brushed over, the idea that if a sacrifice is one you're willing to make, then it's not a sacrifice anymore. It's obviously still a sacrifice. If I have to move countries because that's what my family are doing and I don't want to move countries, that's still a massive sacrifice I'm making. If I move countries and my family come with me, regardless of whether, even though it's not something they necessarily want, they're making a sacrifice. Even if it's something they're doing willingly, they want to do, it's still a sacrifice. All sacrifices feel like sacrifices, regardless of how happy the relationship and the is and how much they're willing to make the sacrifice to the other person. Sacrifices is a product of the cultural background, which my partner has much more clearly pointed out than the opening government, and the cultural backdrop which government is so focused on is one in which these sacrifices are not expressed as sacrifices if they're in a happy relationship. This can lead to resentment because all sacrifices, like I said, are sacrifices. And this is a debate which the government side really doesn't exist in the real world. The opening focus on sexism is just not significant enough to feel like a valuable part of the debate. And as my partner pointed out, the economic reasons are much more serious and a much more valuable way to discuss sacrifices, and also how sacrifices can how unwillingness to make sacrifices or the assumption that sacrifice equals a bad thing can really damage a relationship. The different circumstances put new stresses on a relationship. The refusal to make sacrifices makes everyone sadder. However, if we on the closing opposition half focus on sacrifice as one of the major tenets of any relationship, and that sacrifice is something that's going to happen, people are going to have to compromise, and no one is going to be happy in a relationship all the time, regardless of how loving and happy it otherwise is. We find that our side of the house has the crucial changes. People are happier and relationships are stronger. And for these two reasons, for the strength of relationships and for the generally happier world, which opening government does not bring us to their sacrifices for bad relationships, we beg you to join us in opposing them. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Upwit, and thank you everyone for that debate. You can now leave the room and wait in the main hall, and we'll call you in when we're done. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Fun debate.
Right. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. That'd be great. Thanks.